Career Network's panel discussion on the effects of COVID-19 on the geosciences and the related industries. It's great to have so many of you online. We've already got 110 participants, and I can see it's increasing. I'm Josh Hughes. I'm the Greenland Exploration Manager for Bluejay Mining, which is a London-listed Greenland and Finland-focused base metal exploration company. And I'm also a committee member of the Early Career Network. So I'll be chairing today's discussion. Just to very briefly just introduce the Early Career Network, or the ECN of the Geological Society of London. The ECN is a newly formed group with the purpose of providing support, but also events for early career geoscience professionals and recent graduates, and that's across all sectors of geoscience. We're also here to improve the engagement between the GeolSoc and early career fellows, and the activities of the ECN are mainly aimed at those who are 0 to 10 years post-graduation, but we encourage anyone who has an interest in our events to participate. To fill the void that's been left behind, I suppose, by COVID-19, the ECN have tried to organise a series of online events that I'd quickly like to draw your attention to. So in partnership with IMDEX, we'll be hosting a half-day virtual workshop to introduce their iogas data analysis software. And that will be on Wednesday, the 29th of July. So that will be announced via our mailing list shortly. And we've also been able to secure places on the De Beers Group Institute of Diamonds online diamond foundation course. Now, this is usually a course that costs $250, but the ECN has secured 100 free places for early career geoscientists. We've already received over 200 applications for that, and as a result we'll be closing the sign up early this Friday, so please do sign up by this Friday, 26th of June, to be considered for one of those places. Now, throughout today's session, please use the chat window to put your own questions to the panel, and the ECN chair, Matt Sharp, is also online. He's monitoring your questions, and we'll have time towards the end of the initial discussions to put some of your questions to the panelists. We're also recording today's session, and we'll make it available through the GeolSoc YouTube channel afterwards. Okay, I'd like to start today's discussions then by welcoming our 5 brilliant panelists, asking them to briefly introduce themselves, their backgrounds, and their current roles. Perhaps to kick us off, briefly state what each of you identifies as the biggest factor or the biggest impact facing the geosciences as a result of COVID-19. Okay, so perhaps we can start with Karen.
All right, thank you, Josh. Thank you for inviting me to participate here. My name is Karen Hanghøj, and I'm the director at the British Geological Survey. And so before that, I've had a quite varied background centered on some petrology and some mineral exploration and some innovation networks and things like that. The biggest challenges for geosciences is a tough one, because I think that this pandemic, there are so many challenges all across society, and so there are some impacts, but there's perhaps also some opportunities, and I guess we'll get to those as we move along. I think probably one very, very clear effect that we're seeing already is, of course, the effect on global travel, which is, and also I'd say the effect on the consumption of hydrocarbons that comes with that. So I'm gonna guess that one of the effects that will almost certainly linger is the effect of the oil industry on this, and I think that the downturn in that sector perhaps is going to be longer lasting and possibly even transitioning into the sort of the next moves in terms of moving towards net zero, also across the globe. So I think that is a major impact for geosciences.
Excellent. Okay, Bob, maybe you can introduce
Yep.
yourself.
Effectively, I'm a minerals exploration geologist. So I guess my role today is to comment on the mining industry, exploration and mining, as will Neil and Lauren as well. But probably specifically on reflecting my interests. My first 10 years were exploration and mine geologist in Zimbabwe and a research institute there. 15 years at Southampton University teaching. And halfway through that, I sort of half bounced back to industry, and friends and I started an open pit mining operation. So my career has reflected sort of this interface between industry and academia, which I think reflects a lot of people's expertise and interests. It's just keeping the balance of science while you apply the science. I was manager of minerals consultancy for 6 years, a spin out of an oil consultancy group. And then in 2004, friends and I started a company called Stratex. We listed on the stock exchange in 2006, focusing on exploration in Turkey and then East and West Africa. I stood down with a lot of grey hair, it's getting there anyway, in 2016, and now primarily a consultant. But I have some interest in private companies. As far as the sector's concerned, the mining and exploration sector, obviously closely interlinked. They will bounce back, and it's something we'll address later in ongoing discussions, I'm sure, this morning. My biggest concern is actually what Josh and Matt and others are encouraging us to consider today, and that's the impact on young professionals and the influx of young professionals into our industry over the next few years, because we've been aware of a demographic time bomb for many years. People like myself, a baby boomer, are part of that problem. And we hope we can address it. But this impact is going to be significant, even more so now because of COVID. And I look forward to the discussions later. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Lauren?
Hi, thanks, Josh. My name's Lauren Ballarini. I'm the service lead for hydrogeology and hydrology. I've worked as a hydrogeologist for about 15 years, always as a consultant, firstly, mainly undertaking work in the contaminated land sector, and more recently moving into a varied role that includes supporting planning and permitting applications, mainly within the UK, but also work on international mining projects, as Bob alluded to. In my opinion, the biggest impact facing geoscience is similar to what Karen mentioned there, but from a slightly different angle. We've had quite widely publicised that for the past 2 months, the UK hasn't been burning coal to generate power. And that in itself is a complex issue to do with manufacturing being stopped in the UK, but perhaps continuing in other parts of the world. There's a question about the long-term transition to renewable technologies globally. The short term, the growth in renewables industry has stalled, but recent reports have indicated that it is actually the only sector that is predicted to grow this year, with many global companies still putting energy transition at the centre of their investment strategies. It's going to be interesting to see how the low oil price and the effect on the oil and gas industry could hinder the drive to invest in renewables technology, and thus the engagement of geosciences on that in the long term.
Brilliant. And Neil?
Thanks, Josh. Neil Hutchinson, I'm the MD of the Geoscience business within the RSK group. I've been with RSK now 23 years, joined as a graduate geologist back in the late 90s. Worked way through and became MD 2 years ago. Primarily look at contaminated land, remediation, brownfield within the UK, but also do work across Europe and also East Africa. We've ventured into East Africa in the last 12 months, which has kind of brought a new range of problems to solve. And I guess really with COVID happening in the last 3 months with the pandemic. I think it's that global connection we have is going to be difficult. We've got engineers that we need to get out into country, but obviously with the restrictions and, as the others have said, in terms of the oil price and the move towards net zero, I think that's going to be quite a struggle for us to balance that, and our clients are looking at driving that agenda forward in terms of net zero. So I think we do need to look at how we localize our work going forward. So we have much more localized resource and delivery going forward.
Brilliant. And finally, coming to you, Mike.
Thanks, Josh. Mike Daly. I'm currently president of the society, which I think is probably my role today, although I have others. So I started life as a field geologist next door to Bob in Zambia, actually. Did that for 10 years and then became, wrote a PhD on the back of it and on structural geology and tectonics and stuff. Became a research structural geologist in BP and then an oil explorer. Eventually became chief geologist and an executive on the group executive team in BP. I left BP 6 years ago after almost 30 years in there. And these days I sit on a couple of boards, CGG, a Geoscience technology board, a French company, and Tullow Oil. Recently became president of the society, which is a sort of 2-year event. And the thing I spend a lot of my time at is being an emeritus prof in Oxford, where I have a research grant for continental tectonics and the origin of copper. So I've sort of switched from the petroleum game to the copper game, but minerals actually broaden than just copper. So what's the problem with this virus has created? I mean, the problem is just the massive structural disruption in every business that a geologist or a geoscientist finds themselves in. You know, Karen mentioned the oil world. The 30% drop in the demand for oil in the last half year has reduced capital investment, is causing jobs to have been lost. And maybe, as implied, accelerates the end of the oil sector a little more. But the global development for minerals is going to be hit as well. There's a GDP loss, and we're all looking at how the world comes back. Is it going to bounce back? Is it going to come back slowly? Is it going to be hit by this virus because of secondary and tertiary peaks? We just don't know. Infrastructure projects and engineering is interesting because that is one of the few things government have got to get people back to work after the collapse of an economy. So that may well be a booming part and part of the good luck story here. And in academia, things are pretty tough. Foreign students, to make up a lot of the money that comes into British universities these days, are seeing international travel as a much less attractive option. And so how that all pans out is a big issue as well. So I think, you know, it's just disruption of everything, and with many different solutions and many different ways of working to deal with it.
That's raised a really broad suite of topics. So hopefully we can come back to those through the discussions. Just to move on, the coronavirus crisis has resulted in exceptionally testing times, and that's both on a personal level, but also for the sectors and the organisations that we represent. Now, we've tried to select our panel to represent a range of geoscience sectors. So perhaps to set the context, could each of you briefly highlight how your individual sectors have been affected by COVID-19? Okay, and maybe we can start with Neil.
Yeah, I guess from a geoscience contaminated land point of view, I guess when the lockdown started in March, pretty much all site work stopped overnight. So that was the initial impact to us was was the delivery of site work, which makes up a large proportion of the work that we undertake. The majority of the projects we're involved with have a field work element at the beginning. So that was the major impact, which obviously hit our younger staff more, because they're the guys that are out on site undertaking those investigations, collecting the data. So that was really almost overnight that work stopped in the majority. So then we've then had to look at the ways of new working. So like everybody here working from home, and how we've adapted to that, embracing technology. And then over the last 3 months is looking at identifying and developing safe ways of working, so we can get back out into the field as lockdown has been relaxed over the weeks. Looking at ways of protecting our teams on site to minimise any risk that they're being exposed to. So really that's for us is really how our sector's been hit, and we're still seeing a slow pickup of work, especially in the development sector. That's where we're still seeing the biggest impact in terms of brownfield development, and the number of projects returning slowly or being put on hold. Where we are seeing the biggest increase in activity is in the infrastructure sectors. So the large government schemes are definitely pushing ahead full steam. So they're the ones that I guess are taking up some of the slack. But again, there's an impact on productivity because of the measures we're having to put in place to keep everybody safe on site.
Okay. All right, and Lauren?
My point of view, the water sector, it can almost be split into two different angles, where you're talking about water as a resource and perhaps water as a receptor. The two different areas have been affected very differently. There's a story that goes back to the 2008 when we had a last major recession, where one of the investors who bet against the housing and credit bubble actually made quite a lot of money during the crash. And there's a film called The Big Short about it. And at the end of the film, it says that this particular investor is now putting all his trading into one commodity, which is water. And in much the same way that gold was often seen as a very secure place to put your money, it reflects the fact that, and it's become apparent during this global pandemic, when hand washing and access to clean, safe water has been so important to fight this disease, that water is essential to life and has to be protected and must be treated with respect. Work directly for or in relation to the water companies, which many of the employees of the water companies were given key worker status in the UK, has been largely unaffected. In fact, the main pressure has come from stability for supply, and also taking into account the extreme weather patterns that we've experienced in the UK in 2020. Climate change is going to continue to play a significant part in all aspects of water in the future. And as a side note, short-term effects of the lockdown in the UK was that there was an increase in DIY resulting in water pollution from people getting rid of materials inappropriately down their drains, which still goes to show that education in terms of how vital our water resources is so important. In the long term, as companies look to move away from perhaps their classic office-based working environment, there's going to be new pressure on the water company to deal with supply and treatment, as previously these concentrated areas of people where we had a lot of people in the offices between the classic 9 to 5 situation, and thus demand and discharge was quite well regulated, is perhaps going to become more spread out, and the water companies are going to have to look at how they're going to deal with those changes in the future. I mean, when we're talking about water as a receptor, as Neil touched upon there, our work is mainly to do with planning and permitting, and the halt in a lot of construction activities and site activities that perhaps Neil would have been the front end for had a knock-on effect in a lot of industries and planning work surrounding those industries. The permitting work has been a bit more of a mixed picture, with the Environment Agency issuing regulatory statements in late April, which broadly said that as your regulatory requirements are in place to protect people and the environment, then they're going to expect them to be adhered to, you know, current situation and safety permissible. Further position statements supported this to do with environmental emission monitoring, including water. And while there was some flexibility, generally permitting, they were looking at you to continue this monitoring and take it place as normal, and that is where it would be appropriate for the site. So in the short term, there's been a fluctuation in workloads depending on the sectors, but in the longer term, I would say that environmental permitting, particularly with abstraction licensing being brought under this umbrella, we're going to see that it's going to increase over the next few years, and longer term remain largely as it was previously, though perhaps there'll be a reflection on different sectors where we will be doing that work.
That's brilliant. Mike, perhaps you could talk a little bit about the oil and gas, but also maybe touch upon higher education from your role at Oxford University.
Okay. So even before CV9, the coronavirus arrived, the oil industry was already starting to feel some stress, to put it mildly. And that's really been reflected quite differently across on the two sides of the Atlantic. You know, the European, in the public sector at least, the European majors are really under a lot of pressure from governments and from their investors and from their societies. And clearly now I think all the majors and many of the less majors are quite specific about their ESG goals and specific about their carbon goals, and net zero has almost become a race for the big guys. Everybody's got a 2050 net zero goal, and that's, you know, sort of almost the point of competition rather than finding oil or even producing it at low cost anymore. In contrast, in the US, the majors are basically carrying on as normal, and there is very little hat tipping going to the net zero world or to the low carbon energy transition world. So that's a sort of an interesting break that was happening as we arrived in this. But this fall of demand that I mentioned has really shaken both sides of the Atlantic, and that the oversupply that has resulted because people didn't stop producing, they just carried on producing, but the demand just disappeared because everybody stopped moving. And so the oversupply has really been dramatic, and every tank is full of oil, and every tanker that could be hired or chartered is sitting full of oil at the moment, and people are now reducing supply, in particular the OPEC countries and Russia. But really, that's a sort of short-term thing in a way that can be sorted out. But what can never be recovered is the massive capital flight that's gone from the industry, and that started after the price drop in 2015. There was a big flight of capital then, over $1 trillion reputedly, and that was just recovering in 18, 19, and this year has now disappeared again. And so really two big chunks of money that would have been spent building the future oil developments and maintaining the present ones has not been spent. So that is a big problem for the sector coming forward. And the CV19 thing has just really made what was a difficult situation an almost impossible one now to imagine how this is going to play out in the future. Along with the initiatives people have been taking to move to a lower carbon product, because the only real way to get to net zero is by stopping producing oil. You know, you're not going to be able to re-put in the ground all that carbon. So the underlying direction is clear, but how companies are going to pivot from being companies that produce 2, 3, 4 million barrels of oil a day, a year, a day, to producing none or very little, and replacing that with wind turbines and electricity is a business model that has yet to be invented. The sector has responded by cutting costs, and cutting costs, the main thing is people, but of course delaying projects and all the rest of it as well. And more importantly, banks in the ESG world have sort of seen this as yet another scary thing, and that interest in investing in the sector is disappeared as well. So the companies themselves have stopped spending money, and they're finding it more difficult to find people to invest in them. Bizarrely, they're finding it easy to borrow money. So you may have seen various bond issuance that have gone on, and that people are still prepared to give them money on a debt basis, but in terms of equity, not at all. So it's a pretty tough time in the oil industry, and I can only see it getting tougher. But it's such a big industry, and everything we do relies so basically on it. Even with the rapid growth in renewables, the oil industry is still growing. The demand for oil was growing through the last few years. I expect personally it will continue to grow through a few more years after this. Perhaps it will stop by the end of this decade. Gas will continue to grow beyond that. So the hydrocarbon sector is going to continue to some degree, but it won't be the swashbuckling sector it has been in the last century. In the academic world, I think the academic world is somehow actually getting, well, at the research end of the academic world, it's getting smaller because it's sort of difficult to find money, but it's getting quite focused. And the invention of UKRI has brought a lot of clarity, to me at least, in terms of what Britain is prepared to fund. And some perhaps don't want to spend too much time on this now, but it is something to come back to, Josh, that as we look to the future, I think one of the big leading indicators of the future is where the research money is being spent today. And so I think the university sector for earth scientists is actually really positive if you're in the right business and you have the right skills. If you're in the business that probably Bob and I were, apologies, Bob, you may have been doing something different, but so if I made very large maps in the 10 years I was in Africa. It's an obsolete thing now. No one does it. The same information that took me 6, 7, 8 years to collect, you can do in 6 months now. And it's just changing. So I think academia has actually got interesting, super things to do, but it's a very small and competitive sector. Just a word on the Geological Society as well. Clearly, that's taken a big hit through this. It's lost all its conference revenue for the year. It's furloughed a number of people. But on the positive, the society has been forced into virtual meetings like this one. And it's actually just suddenly realized it's got a whole new capability and it can reach a whole new level of people. And it ran a conference 2 weeks ago, or we called it a summit, Future of Geoscience. And there were over 1,000 people who signed into that. And the feedback from it has been fantastic. So, and in parallel to this meeting, actually, there's another one going on how we get more students into society, into school and into university doing geology. And even the AGM was virtual, which is against all the regulations of the society, but actually, it was the only way to have an AGM. So the society looks like it has a much less London-centric future, which I think will please a lot of people. And actually some new techniques to spread the word and to interact. I think we'll stop there, Josh.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Bob, maybe as a comparison, how's the exploration and mining industry? been
Well, I guess obviously, sorry, the mining industry took a fairly immediate hit in terms of suspension of quite often underground operations in particular, primarily for health concerns. What is interesting as a spin-off is how some of the majors actually responded positively in terms of substantial support for their employees and their communities, Anglo-American in particular. But that was a positive, which I think might be carried forward will be carried forward more and more into the future. Slightly less directly, obviously, the manufacturing industry, construction industry slowed down dramatically in the early part of this year, and that has had a knock-on effect to mining activity itself and what metals are produced and how quickly. The plus of all this, if there is a plus in terms of this horrible virus, is that China's ahead of the curve and was emerging even as we were still beginning to go downhill. And of course, like many of the major economies, they've provided massive stimulus with encouraging infrastructure rebuilding programs, etc. And already that's taken an effect, I'm pleased to say. The demand for iron ore, for copper, base metals is dramatically re-escalating. The prices have recovered pretty quickly. So from that point of view, there's a good degree of encouragement. The USA, the Eurozone is looking at the same stimulus packages and that's further afield as well. So as far as mining and the bounce back of the industry, probably relatively quick. Of course, there's a knock-on effect with exploration because it's impacted by the same factors. Some exploration certainly was maintained. It does lend itself in certain circumstances to social distancing, so that's a plus. I suspect you yourself were somehow caught up in that, Josh. Although I guess Greenland is not the best time of the year during winter to actually do too much field work. Smaller companies in the UK adopted the furlough scheme. I'm not sure how widely that was applied around the world. One of the pluses, again, I suspect, is that if you look at the junior market on AIM, alternative investment market, no companies have gone under. I think that was primarily because already they'd positioned themselves in a default basis to be leaner and meaner. So they were reasonably well established to survive this. Quite recently, in the last month or two, we've seen fairly substantial financing on the London market, which again is some encouragement. I heard the Mining Journal commented recently the junior sector is raring to go. I'm not quite sure whether that's exactly right, but certainly it's poised. So overall, looking at the majors and the juniors, I mean, the gold remains in demand, of course, and that's survived very positively, primarily because of this whole concept of investment hedging against risk. Gold had taken a back step in relation to the dollar being a best hedge. It's now recovered that position for a whole raft of reasons, some of which Mike touched upon. But overall, we're not going to see a V-shaped recovery. It is going to be a U-shape. But in my opinion, the shape of that U is going to be somewhat narrower than some of the more pessimistic people. We must be careful about over-egging it, but I think we're going to see a reasonable recovery, at least from that sector. So I'm fingers crossed, and hopefully this will be a knock-on effect about employment, etc., but something we can address later in the discussion.
Fantastic, yeah. No, I think as well, coming back to a point Karen made earlier about international travel, I think that, that's been our, speaking from the exploration side of things, that's been our biggest impact is, all these restrictions on international travel, countries closing their borders. That's meant that many of our exploration programs have either been postponed or cancelled. And really it's been, I think what's struck me is how rapid this change was. So, going back to early March, around the time of PDAC in Toronto, there's a mining convention, around 25,000 people there, and the mood was positive. And then the week of return from PDAC, it was as if the mining industry dropped off a cliff. And like you said, Bob, I think there has been quite a remarkable recovery, since then. But yeah, bring that.
Interesting comment there, Josh. You just touched on travel, as did Karen. Some of the companies that will have actually survived this better than most, particularly on the exploration side, but it applies to the mining side more automatically anyway, but on the exploration side, those that have been using a large proportion of local people to drive their programs rather than expatriates will have been in a positive position, something worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, no, definitely. Karen, perhaps we can come to you just to finish off that question. So that's about the...
Yeah, so I guess I'm sort of, I think I'm wearing the public sector research organization type hat, although I do also, of course, sort of represent a little bit the sort of mineral industry as well. So we have that quite well presented. And actually from sort of public sector perspective, one of the interesting things, just to follow up on the minerals, is actually the disruption that we're seeing on societal level. So the value chain disruption that we're seeing, and how the manufacturing industry is now somewhat scrambling to secure their supply of certain metals and certain minerals. And this is actually something we've already taken on and gotten a little research grant to start looking at, that how can we advise government and advise the sectors to be able to actually handle disruption like this on a sort of a little bit grander scale. For the research sector as such, or for the Geological Survey as such, we do still a little bit of mapping, but that's actually one, of course, of the challenges that we do have now. So basically, in the sort of short term, for this pandemic, we've sort of looked at 4 areas that are sort of critical to our business, and one is fieldwork, which has obviously been disrupted a lot, and another one is travel. And we separate them a little bit because a lot of our travel has to do with fieldwork and has to do with UK things, but also we have quite a bit of international travel on many of our projects. Then we have our laboratories, and finally we have our office work. So we've basically sort of looked at those 4 things separately and tried to come up with recovery plans for all of those. And some are affected a lot, like the international travel. The field work was initially affected a lot, but now it's actually starting to become more possible, because oftentimes you are out in an isolated kind of way. So it's something that we've been able to pick up slightly quicker. I'm actually in my office. I'm not really in Greenland. I'm actually in my office, and BGS did open about 4 weeks ago, but with very limited numbers coming in. And that's actually because of the laboratories, because that was another thing that we felt that we really wanted to get back into the labs and be able to actually drive some of our analytical work. And that we have also started up. And then finally, there's the office work, and that's actually not really necessarily suffered very much. I mean, scientists have been, they can work from home, they can write papers, they can write proposals, they can do many of those things. And in some respects, some have actually welcomed maybe that little bit of break from traveling so much, participating in conferences, doing things. But obviously, like everyone else across society, we've had to balance it against sort of personal challenges with homeschooling or other types of things that have had to fit into this sort of home working world. On a sort of slightly longer term, I think that we will actually bounce back, not just the research sector, but I actually think the geoscience sector will bounce back, because geosciences is so fundamental for so many different sectors, many of which will need to kind of bounce back. Again, maybe the oil industry being the exception to that. But then again, if we want to talk about decarbonization, that also requires geoscientific skills, and actually many of the same skills that we need in the sort of carbonization. And as I just sort of mentioned on the mineral side, understanding the grander picture of the value chain and being able to advise society, educate the general public, but also educate locally, I think is going to be extremely important. So in the long term, we are actually not anticipating a huge impact, let's say, in the geosciences research area. I will say, though, that they have, of course, also, even though we're not a higher education institution as such, We do currently have something like 200 PhD students at BGS using our labs, using our staff for advice and mentorship and working on our projects. And we have a lot of other early career scientists that come in and do postdocs. And again, typically in the slightly more applied geosciences, but actually also in more basic geosciences. And obviously they have been struggling particularly because of their fairly short-term view on finishing their thesis, getting their analysis done, getting into the field within their PhD period or within their postdoc period. But we are, of course, part of UKRI. And as Mike said, I think UKRI are from central hold looking at this very holistically and are trying to come up with solutions to make sure that all of the early career people are actually being helped through this time. So I think, again, there's some disruption now, but I, to be honest, don't think that that early career scientists will suffer in their studies or in their postdocs from this pandemic. At least I really hope not, and I can also assure that we will try to do whatever we can to support people in that position as we move forward. I think that was probably what I wanted to say on that.
Excellent. That kind of brings us, I suppose, into the next question, which was, with evidence suggesting that early career professionals are perhaps one of the groups that are most severely affected by the pandemic. Many are finding themselves on the government furlough scheme or unemployed. What skills should early career professionals be focusing on developing right now? And what new skill sets do you think will be important in a post-COVID world? And perhaps Lauren, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to not use a geological skill, I've got to say. My skill that I think that geoscientists as a whole, early careers or not, should be focusing on is their communication skills. There's a commonly held belief that 55% of communication is actually body language. Well, you can only see my body from here upwards. 38% is tone of voice and 7% are actual words spoken. With the advent of remote working, not everybody has access to reliable video conferencing equipment, and certainly in rural areas in the country and globally, reliable internet. Over half the means of conveying a message has therefore been lost through moving to perhaps this remote working, which I think is here to stay for a while yet. Clear, concise and balanced verbal communication skills are required more so now than at any other time. And in a similar vein, the written word is being relied upon more and more. And I think probably everybody has been in the situation where they've been involved in a 14-page email thread, which could have been solved by a 10-minute phone call. Whilst there's a move to try and return to the office setting where possible, lots of companies are actively reconsidering their need for these offices, or certainly the size of them if they don't own them, and perhaps looking when their office rents are up to move to smaller premises. And more flexible working arrangements are likely to become commonplace in future, driven to some part by the demands of the workforce. So in a post-COVID world, flexibility is going to be one of the watchwords for people. I think the ability to adapt to changing situations and to move with the ebb and flow of opportunities as they present themselves is certainly going to put people in a good position to move with the times as of such. And at the risk of stealing Neil's thunder here, I think BIM and the digital management of data is going to become more and more critical. As Mike was saying earlier, the days of 6 months of remote mapping and us all carrying our mapping tubes back on a plane from whatever field exploration is gone, and how we collect and handle and manage data, which certainly as consultants is perhaps the key thing that we are paid for, taking data in, analysing it and turning it around in a methodology which whoever our target audience can manage. Ultimately, what we are being paid for is to handle that data. So I would say those two areas for me are the key skills that geoscientists need to be focusing on in the future.
Mike, I can see you nodding away there. Do you want to take the question next?
Okay. Yeah. Well, so I think the question, there's two halves to it, but basically you're asking what are the right skills for geoscientists of the future. And we all try and predict the future, and we all know it's a stupid thing to do because we're always wrong in doing it, but you have to try. And one of the good ways to get into that is to look for sort of leading indicators of the future. And so this goes back to the UKRI, because they are, UKRI, which is UK Research and Innovation for people, if not everybody knows the acronym. They're Britain's sort of organisation for research in which natural sciences fit. And their strapline is ensuring research and innovation flourishes in the UK. And they spend something like 2.5% of our GDP, which is about $7 billion. So, they spend a lot of money. And they measure themselves on the growth in knowledge, culture, and society. And so, well, knowledge and the cultural and the societal impact of that knowledge. So if we look at them, the fastest growing area of money, of input of their money, is into computational modeling, just in a manner that Lauren said, computational modeling, machine learning, the AI, big data handling stuff. In the last decade, it's grown by almost 50%, the amount of money they've put into that. And that 50% has mostly been in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think to me that is indicative of, if geoscientists today can no longer just have field skills. They have to have computational skills, they have to have numerical modeling skills. And that is, in this time, the thing that is really worth catching up on if you haven't got. If I think about my lifetime, it was a trauma to move from tracing paper, light tables and maps to the workstation. But that happened over maybe a decade. This is happening much faster, and no one can afford to not be part of this world of increased data analysis and modeling and using of data and being just comfortable with it. The top spend that UKRI have put into natural sciences is in what they call the energy transition and materials. I think they put in about 700 million last year. So $700 million of research money into that sector. And it's a broad bucket, but it includes CCS and waste management, radioactive waste as well. But it's also the other big choke in the mineral and the energy transition is having enough of the right minerals to transmit and store electricity. And so copper for its transmission, and cobalt, lithium, magnesium, and stuff like that for the storage of this stuff are all things, minerals, and their systems and their the endowment and their distribution around the world is getting a lot of attention from them, as is the ESG aspect of minerals. I mean, in the oil world, we've always been beholden to OPEC. In the cobalt world, we are beholden to certain African countries where all the cobalt is, and people, that's never a good situation to be. I'll leave, I'm sure Bob sort of says quite a bit about that as well. So the third thing, of course, is climate change, and the fourth ranked bucket that UKRI fund is the planetary and solar research. But the other thing for sort of young people to be thinking about is where the government spends its money. And there is a vast amount of money going into infrastructure projects today. HS2, Crossrail, the water pipelines of Northern England, and there's this sort of notion of a thing called urban geoscience, or the humanosphere, the thing that sits between the lithosphere and the atmosphere. And that area is attracting huge investment because as we get more people, we need to live and we need to move them around. And whilst the CV19 world is going to put a dent in all that, it's still, people are still going to be moving and still going to want to be able to do that as we come out of it and learn how to deal with it. So it seems to me that that's a real big opportunity for people and for sort of engineering geologists and environmental geologists and people who manage waste and land stability and stuff. So those would be my sort of areas how I'd see the future for a geoscientist, and you pick the one that fits, appeals to you. But computational modeling is going to be big in all those areas.
Karen, do you want to follow on from there?
What did you say?
Do you want to follow on from Mike's points there?
Okay, yes, sorry, I didn't actually hear that you said me. I think I agree completely with both Lauren and Mike on all of the points that they've made. So I'm not necessarily going to reiterate all of them, but I do think we also have to make sure that we have the basic geological skills, because there's always this bandwagon a little bit about new skills, and I completely agree that flexibility, adaptability, digital skills, communication skills, all of those are going to be important, but they've actually also been important in the past. We might not have been as visible as it is now, where we are communicating in new ways, but we are still the only ones that actually really gets the subsurface. I'm sort of happy that Mike mentioned the subsurface. This is London's subsurface in Lego that I actually got as a present on my first day at BGS. But so many people think about urbanization as stuff going up. And the thing is that in all those kinds of, whenever we want to do anything on the surface, we are utilizing some portion of the subsurface. And that's really where our expertise is unique. So while we have a lot of overlap with other types of people, engineers, environmental scientists, chemists, all those people, the basic skills of actually being able to look at the subsurface and understand the subsurface in 4 dimensions, we're the only ones that have that skill. So we shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't forget the basic geological skills, which is also why, I mean, as I said before, that we do mapping at BGS. We don't do much mapping, to be honest. And it's true, like Mike said, that there are many things we can do much quicker. We can use geophysical methods. We can do many, many things. But we mustn't forget that that is actually what sets us apart. And we should be talking about that. And we've had this period globally for now a couple of decades where all geology departments have changed their names to Department of Earth and Environmental Science or Department of this and that. We have stopped talking about mapping. All geological surveys have basically sort of not using the M word. We use something a little bit more flashy. And so I think we need to acknowledge that we have that basic, we know how to look at a thin section, we know how to look at a map, we know how to look at the subsurface, but we have to be much, much better at inserting ourselves into those overlaps with other groups and explain to people that geosciences is pretty much at the core of every single societal issue that we want to address in the future. Energy transition, environmental, all those kinds of things, be right at the core of it. So getting outside, it's great to be in this forum, and I'm guessing that there's a lot of geoscientists listening in, and that's really good, but we really have to make sure that we take this conversation also out of this virtual room and into rooms where people don't actually know what we do and understand the importance of it. Brilliant. That's maybe that's a job for the Geological Society and maybe also for BGS.
Brilliant. Bob, just very, very quickly, mineral exploration, what new skills would you be working on developing?
Well, for once, I'm almost lost for words here because everything's being said in the right context. But obviously, it's so important to all the people out there. I know it would be endorsed by everybody listening that I'm facing at the moment. That field skills still remain important, but we have to recognise that the opportunity for early career professionals at the moment to get out and develop their field skills is going to be limited. So how do you make best use of your time? Yes, certainly develop the computational skills that Mike was talking about. Big data is so important. Mining or exploration in general quite often involves a company looking at the ground for about the 4th company in succession. Look at an area. So looking at legacy archives, databases, and making sense of them is so important. So develop those skills. Something that's obvious from this discussion and others is that there's a whole range of online seminars that are now available, which people should position and take the opportunity to pursue. The SEG, the GSA, and IGOD have developed this Ore Deposits Hub. There's been about 15 or 20 fantastic webinars. So use those to build your skills. Point made by Mike, and that is that think about mining and geotechnical in general. Exploration and simple being a mine geologist, not that we're all simple, but getting underground isn't just the only way forward. You know, the geotechnical side, when we have people involved in this discussion today who can, you know, advise on that, geomet. But one other thing I would recommend to a skill to people listening, or perhaps at the earlier careers, if you're looking at a company, develop your financial skills. And quite simply, if you're looking at a junior company in particular, or a mid-tier company, you're thinking of applying to them for employment, look at their annual reports, or better still, just go to their most recent presentation. Have they got the cash to deliver what they're promising their shareholders to do? If they've got $1 million in the bank, look elsewhere.
Excellent. Finally, Neil, anything specific to your industry?
I guess a lot's been said. I guess Lauren picked up on the BIM and the data collection. I think technology was coming through already within our industry, but I think the last few months has just speeded that process up hugely. You know, we're looking at how we can minimize the amount of travel that our guys are doing, you know, the amount of time they're spending on site, and looking at data collection, remote data collection. So I think it's looking at that technology, and I guess just picking on Bob, there's a wealth of knowledge out there on the internet in terms of free webinars, seminars that are available, and it's something a lot of the environmental bodies have done over the last few months, is really focused on that, to give that resource available to everybody within the industry. So it's something that a lot of our, you know, we've had a number of people on furlough. Luckily, they're starting to come back into the business now as work picks up. But it's something we'd encourage all of our guys to go and do, is to go and we've given them a dossier of all of that online resource, and really encourage them to go and use that time to upskill, really, in terms of understanding their knowledge and looking at, you know, areas. As Mike said, infrastructure is a huge area. You know, it's the area that's come back quickest within our industry. With all of the work around HS2, new nuclear build, you know, the large road schemes, they're back up and running and trying to play catch up. So that's really, you know, it's those key skills. But yeah, using technology and communication in the new world. We won't be returning back to the offices that we had 3 months ago. Even, you know, we can't do it in the short term, but long term we will be looking at, you know, more regional resource allocation to minimize down on travel, you know, and that's the, I guess, the area to look at is technology would be top of the list.
Brilliant. Okay, just very quickly, I suppose, on the subject, you know, we touched on fieldwork there a little bit. On the subject of fieldwork, you know, a lot of current geology students or early career researchers who rely on fieldwork to develop essential skills or to collect data, they're now faced with obstacles or restrictions on travel. Mapping projects, fieldwork, student placements have all been halted. Some universities are even cancelling all of their face-to-face teaching for the next academic year. Now, what effect will this have on future expertise, and particularly, you know, let's talk about field skills? Can virtual geoscience really be used to replicate field skills? Bob, maybe you can take this one.
That really is a tough call. I think at the end of the day that they really can't replicate field skills, perhaps only superficially. It can introduce you to the observations that you should make, guided by an expert. There's not the opportunity to discuss on the rock the interpretation of what it means on the immediate exploration implications, the regional geodynamic evolution, etc. So it's not easy, and I think we mustn't fool ourselves. We have got a major problem here, and in many ways, there has to be, going forward, there's going to be a gap in the short term. And that means that in the meantime, virtual skills can help to develop that, but we've got to start, assume there's a gap, we've got to start planning for the longer term now, and we've got to see putting in place partnership schemes between the major companies, by the universities, to actually step into and reinforce that situation or reinforce that training as soon as the opportunity becomes available. So industry professional society initiatives, I think, just sort of thing that Mike's involved in fact you yourself, Josh. I think we've got to focus on those now, accepting that people can look at the webinars we've talked about and at least develop a knowledge base, but that's not a field skill. So we can't replace that at the moment. Let's begin to plan to replace that as soon as we can.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to come back to Bob's comments?
I completely agree. I don't think there are things you cannot learn virtually. Learning a lot virtually, of course, is not going to make you a worse field geologist either. So use the opportunities you have. But I think we need to catch up, actually. So what I would say to ourselves and to the early career scientists out there, okay, you won't get in the field this year. Make sure that you get out twice as much next year, because I think that we need to do that, and we need to maybe the organizations that can take responsibility for this should absolutely do it, because you cannot learn looking at rocks by not looking at rocks. Not gonna work.
Mike, do you think that's something that the Geological Society would take as a responsibility?
The society will certainly support that direction. Yeah, I mean there are a number of ways. Well, let's stay on the society for a moment. There are a number of ways the society can help, and the most obvious way as this thing plays out is through the regional societies that exist. They all run fieldwork trips, from weekend day trips down to cliffs and epic sections to week-long traverses across the Lake District, and so through the society you can deepen your field skills. I think there is something here about distinguishing between the basic skills and then experience. The virtual world of drone technology these days is pretty advanced, and there's a company who I declare sort of a conflict. I know the lady who runs it. She's ex-BP. She worked for me in those days, and she has created a thing called image reality, and she has got down to the detail of being able to look at trough cross bedding and measure things in virtual space. It is not the sort of basic field skill that Bob was referring to, but it is a way of getting experience of, let's say, the County Mayo Northwest Island turbidite section, or the Moyne Thrust, or because you already go to it with some knowledge of rocks and how to describe them, and the way you approach an outcrop, and that basic workflow that individuals have to go and look at rocks. So I think the basic skills it doesn't support, but it does broaden your experience and give you a sense of, for me, one of the big things about geology is scale, and the scale of turbidite beds, the scale of big corallic sandstones, the whole scale thing, you can get quite quickly from looking at really good virtual images. What you can't get is the context and the detail and the bigger story. So yes, I completely agree that we still need the skills. What's interesting about students these days is something I'd just like to sort of make a point on. I mean, out of a class the classes I've been involved with since I left BP, and I run 2 field trips, and I run them with other people. One to Spain, which is a basin analysis trip, and one to Greece, which is looking at faults and things. And probably 30% of the people, 30% really want to be there, and they are as enthusiastic as anybody could possibly be, and they're stimulating to work with. There are 30% who actually don't want to be there. and that they are passionate about being geologists, and they see geology they don't see that as their geology, they see it as someone else's geology, and what they're interested in is ocean chemistry, corals, you know, a whole different part of things that doesn't mean standing on a hillside in the rain looking across a great view and sketching it. And I think we need to challenge ourselves, because there is a certain thing in geology that there's almost a rites of passage of doing certain things. And that a part of that is this getting wet in the field and showing you're a field geologist. And I think for a lot of people who join our science today, actually that's inappropriate. And we need to sort of find a way that we can acknowledge and cope with that, and still feel these people are valid geologists doing valid geoscience that is going to move everything forward. So I think there's a dilemma for the science here, and in the society, it's one of the things we're facing, that the society accredits degrees. And to me, I think the blanket thing of so many days the person has to do individual fieldwork, it needs to be challenged, and it needs to become a little more nuanced about how people do geology in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Okay, in the interest of time then, so we can have some questions from the audience, I think we'll just have one final question, perhaps Lauren and Neil can take, is will we be returning to business as usual, or will our geoscience industries be permanently changed by the pandemic? Will the longer term impacts of COVID-19 on the geosciences, what will they be, and what will be perhaps our new normal going forward? Neil, do you want to?
I guess, will it change? Yes, it will. I think what we do technically won't, I don't think, other than the speed of an introduction of more technology being used in what we do. I think the office space that we occupy will disappear. But yeah, I think the key aspect is that it will return. You know, there's still the huge demand for housing in the UK. That still hasn't changed and won't change for the foreseeable future. So that's something that we are instrumental in delivering. You know, there's still the drive around looking at brownfield redevelopment, you know, moving away from the large greenfield, greenbelt issues. So, you know, there are huge opportunities for us to develop, you know, and the infrastructure spend, as we've talked about previously, you know, we really see it as a positive time within our industry. We see that this is a short-term impact. We're looking ahead, you know, this year will be difficult. There's no doubt about it, but we still make sure that we still need to invest in the new graduates coming through. You know, we learned very quickly from the last recession in 2008, 2009, that actually this is the time we've got to invest in our junior engineers and geologists. You know, we've got to continue with those graduate trainee schemes that we've built up over the years. You know, if we don't do that now, we'll have this knowledge gap, you know, 2-3 years down the line, which is what we saw during the last recession. And that's something that we will be focusing on, you know, both the company I'm within, but also, you know, the wider sector is something that, you know, that's the key for us, is the sector will carry on. We have huge opportunities with renewables and diversifying in the work streams that we currently deliver. And there will never be the legacy that we still deal with from the petroleum sector. That will carry on, you know, the contamination from previous industry. But I'm trying to manage that going forward through the permitting that Lauren's talked about, you know, and managing and reducing the impact of our activities on the planet. So yeah, I mean, we see positive, we see growth, but yeah, we see a short-term impact, but a long-term positives with everything that we see around us.
Brilliant. Okay, and Lauren, just to wrap up on that question, what's the new normal?
I completely agree with what Neil's just said. I think in terms of consultancy and specifically hydrogeology, the work streams overall are going to be there. Quite where the focus might sit will shift. And I think there will be definitely a push towards the ever elusive work-life balance that everybody talks about being able to manage. And I think one of the interesting things that has come out of this for me is that the team I ran was largely a virtual team anyway. We were across a number of offices, and all that happened was on the first day we went into lockdown, when we had our Monday morning call to catch up with people, is rather than seeing the London office backdrop, I was seeing somebody's spare bedroom backdrop. Nothing changed about how we operated as a team on the whole. Nothing changed in how we operated as geologists. And I think there will be a drive, and I think businesses are going to have to react to it, to people wanting this flexibility and this ability to work from home. But I think also as new professionals that you are going to be required to make sure that your business is looking after your mentoring, your training, and also taking care of your health and well-being, because companies still have a responsibility to you as employers to make sure that you are healthy, whether you are in the workplace, whether you're in the field, which we're well aware of, in the office we're well aware of. But perhaps if we're doing more working from home, it can become difficult to manage and difficult to support people. And as a self-proclaimed workaholic, it's very easy working from home to find extra hours, which perhaps I should be spending with my family to actually be putting together that proposal or working on something else, because I'm not getting that break between the very clearly defined office role and the very clearly defined home role. But I do think this is a fantastic opportunity to everybody, and I know that they're early careers geologists on this call, but up to 10 years, perhaps to look at that working life balance, particularly as you are already parents or you come to be becoming parents. And I'd like to say, actually focus on men in this call and the opportunity for you to be present in your children's lives, which perhaps several generations ago wasn't there as an opportunity for you, because the perception was that the 9-to-5 role was there and that women took on the main part of the childcare. I think now for everybody, in the days that we're striving towards equality, that people should be looking at that balance within their lives to be able to deliver at home as well as at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just adding on there, as you know, from a remote working point of view, from a company perspective, you know, obviously gives you access to a much wider pool of talent as well. You know, if you're not expecting individuals to relocate to a specific location, and that flexibility to, you know, to attract the right candidates. But okay, so in the interest of time, let's move to some of the audience questions. Matt Sharp, who is the ECN chair, has been monitoring the chat. So Matt's going to just read out the first question to the panel.
Also questions. Questions two places actually, just so you are aware. Both the chat and the Q&A.
Okay. Matt, do you want to?
Something that both Neil and Lauren have touched on before, but what support can companies and sectors provide to early career geoscientists to replace face-to-face and on-the-job training missed while working at home?
Who wants to take that?
I guess it's difficult. I'll take it for a starter. It's difficult to replace it. I think, as Bob said, we're probably going to have to play catch up once restrictions allow more access to the field. We are sending out some of our junior engineers onto some of the large infrastructure projects. But again, at the moment, we've got to be really careful around the social distancing and not introducing too many people onto sites. You know, we are, you know, as you said, there's online support, but nothing can replace that in the field knowledge. So I think, unfortunately, for the foreseeable, that will be restricted, and we will have to look at, you know, how we reinstate that hopefully next year, you know, if that's permitted.
I think it's a very fair question. but in some ways it's a two-edged sword as well. Companies could perhaps at least provide in-house training courses online using the kind of webinar approach. But equally, with the greatest respect to the person that asked the question, it's an opportunity for you to actually put a wedge your foot in the door by actually taking on board courses in your own time to demonstrate your commitment to your career and perhaps impress your company or your future employers. So it's a bit of give and take.
To add to what Neil said, I think it's been talked about quite a lot, and this is again from a UK perspective. I think international work is far more difficult to manage in terms of face-to-face and on-the-job training. But from a UK perspective, we found, particularly as in field work within the UK, because we've been restricted by travel, I've not had my usual ability to put people in different places to be able to collect the data that I've needed for projects. And so I've relied on a wider body of geologists within my organisation who are all fundamentally geologists, but perhaps not hydrogeologists or perhaps not water engineers and things like that. And I've been really pleased with how the basic core skills that they were taught at university, which might have only been a module or a couple of lectures, has resurfaced to the front of the brain when I've made conversation about it. And actually, the ability to train people in the field, on the whole, you're stood in the middle of the open air. And yes, it's not the same as perhaps clustering around the borehole and pointing something out, but there is still ability to do it if you have the willpower to do it. And only yesterday, one of my team trained somebody how to use a particular type of pump that they'd never used before in the middle of Newcastle city centre using Teams, because that was what we needed her to do to be able to go out and do a job. So I think it's being creative. It's not taking no for an answer. It's working with your management to get what you need to get out of this. And I think it can carry on. And I think site work particularly is something that there's nothing to beat going and standing on the edge of a quarry or edge of a mine and having somebody with that experience point out what these features are to you. And luckily quarries and mines are large enough that you can still do that.
Brilliant. Excellent. Okay, Matt, next question.
With such drastic restrictions placed on travel, both domestically and internationally, industry is now likely to consider a push for geoscientists to either temporarily or permanently relocate closer to their areas of work. Should early career geoscientists be prepared to relocate in search of work as travel is reduced? And in turn, as other countries return to field operations, jobs that may have typically been filled by UK grads and skilled geoscientists are being supplied locally or from other nations. Do you expect these jobs to return post-coronavirus now, or do you think these countries will realise they do not need to import from the UK or have new agreements elsewhere?
I think that's something I touched on briefly in a comment much earlier about involvement of, which is so important to the development of local economies and countries themselves, employment of local people. So I think, yes, it may accentuate that shift. Sorry, what was the first part of the question again, briefly? There was two parts.
Industry is now likely to consider a push for geoscientists to temporarily or permanently relocate closer to their areas of work.
Yeah, I think industry itself has always been of the view, particularly I'm talking about exploration now and perhaps mining as well, to have locally based people, either locally indigenous people or expatriates who are committing to a project and prepared to become involved with that project, and the communities, of course, in the countries involved. I think that's a push that will be welcomed by the industry, but it comes down to a lifestyle choice, which is Lauren has particularly commented on, and others. It's a tough call, but it may be one that you have to make to get on.
It occurs to me that in times of stress, companies usually centralize, because the more expatriates you have overseas, the higher cost it is for you. I mean, even if you don't pay them vast amounts of uplift, they have airplanes, they have kids in school and all the rest of it. So I think you should expect that, to my way of thinking, that the reverse, that the opportunities for people to go overseas is probably going to be less. And what if the companies will do is actually accelerate their nationalization policies.
Yeah.
So I mean, that would to me be the natural. If it was my company, that's where I'd go. And then you make sure you have an absolutely top class group of people at home who can help and make sure that the people who are in the field and are doing the right thing, in much the way Lauren has just described, be it dealing with instruments or just looking at outcrops.
Okay, Matt, any more questions?
It's been well publicised that there's been a large wave of redundancies within the oil industry. How do these vacancy numbers compare to other sectors, and what knock-on effects do you expect this wave of redundancies within the oil and gas sector to have on the other geoscience sectors?
Mike, maybe you're best placed to address that.
Well, I don't have that data in front of me, but my sense is that the redundancies coming out of the oil sector will be orders of magnitude larger than any other sector that employs geoscientists. You know, that everybody's had disruption, but I don't believe anybody's had the 30% drop in the demand for their product, on top of the overall transition into a lower carbon world, on top of the depression or the recession in the oil world that went on after 2014 and 15's oil price collapse. So I think probably, you know, there's a quip on most management tables that you should never waste a crisis. And that usually means a major cost-cutting exercise, which usually means that you yet again try and search for the most effective and efficient organization, which usually means losing people. How it affects the long term, inside the oil industry, I think it reflects a move from frontier exploration, which was the game I was involved with, and the search for volumes of petroleum, and a cavalier attitude to value that went on to the sort of 2000 to 2010. Everybody suddenly realized the actual real purpose was to create value, and that became the big motto. And now it's actually decarbonize. So the idea of frontier exploration is finding a few followers these days. The idea of exploration in places like the North Sea around the fields is getting a lot of attention. And the quality of data that's appearing to support that is phenomenal. I mean, there's the company I work for, the French company I work for, is doing a merged survey of the central North Sea at the moment, and it's like looking at a different basin I thought I knew well. It's fantastic to see, but it's just the whole thing is moving in a direction of shrinkage to what you know, and knowing it better and better and better, and making less mistakes and being more efficient at it. And so that is a geoscience game, but it's also an engineer's game. And so if you think of the past of the oil industry, it was probably dominated by geologists with a lot of engineers, and now it's certainly increasingly dominated by engineers with a few geologists who are in it. So I think that sector is shrinking, but will, you know, not to zero. It's got a lifetime through this century, but it will continue to shrink. But I think Bob's world is going to grow. I think the demand for minerals for the energy transition is going to become increasingly challenging for us, and geologists will be needed for that, and in infrastructure, as we've said.
Okay, we've only got a few more minutes left, so what I'm going to do is just wrap up with a final question to all the panelists. If you could just say it in less than 60 seconds each. But as the current crisis begins to subside, what do you all see as the positive outcomes? Karen?
Well, I mean, one of the positive outcomes we've covered already is that we are learning to work in new ways, and maybe to prioritize the way that we work. I had a completely full calendar in March and April of things that were all incredibly important. and I didn't do any of them, and it turned out that everyone survived that. So I think that sort of perspective on what do we actually need, I think is going to be very important. And secondly, I think again the focus on science being part of the solution to everything is something that I think that is a message that we have. Of course, also before COVID, this was also an important message that we needed to get out. But I think we have a sort of window of opportunity to really make sure that we hit the ground running on the other side for the geosciences. And I actually am an optimist that we can make that happen, because all of the major agenda points, we've had time now to sort of think about them a little bit, not being distracted by all of the travel and all of the field work. And now we can really go in there and make an impact.
Brilliant. Neil?
Yeah, I think we've seen, I think that communication has improved. Ironically, that we're actually more disparately spread across, all working from home, but actually we're probably more connected than ever. I think more calls, video conferences actually, and people are especially taking more time to ask about people's mental health and well-being. And I think that's something that was on the agenda, but I think it's been put into sharp focus that because we are disparate, there is more focus on that, as Lauren said. That I think that's something that will be front and center for us in terms of the health and well-being of everybody within our business. It's more important than ever because we are all so disparately spread across the UK at the moment.
Brilliant. Okay, and Bob?
I think most importantly, the pandemic, if there's anything good can come out of something terrible like this, is the increased focus on environmental concerns and green energy. And it's a point that Mike touched on, that there is a positive, I think, for the mining industry. Not only will infrastructure bounce back and be continued essential, the base metals, the iron ores of this world, in demand for years to come, we're going to see an increased focus on the energy metals and all the science that involves. So I think the implications for further good science, as well as the requirement for very focused geologists with particular expertise in that area, is one element of good news emerging from this terrible situation.
Okay, and Lauren?
For me, one of the positive outcomes that have come from this is there's a saying that people buy people, and I've found it very useful both with my colleagues and my clients. There's always a difficulty in holding people at arm's length in terms of what counts as professionalism, and it's been the opportunity to see beyond the person you meet in the office and get to know them as a person. And I found that a lot of good contacts I had both within the industry, with clients, with colleagues, have strengthened further through this by all being in the same boat, though perhaps in a different, but all being in the same storm, but perhaps in a different boat.
Excellent. Okay, and Mike, just to finish.
Well, I think we're all in the middle of a crisis, and it's really important not to focus on the crisis and focus on the now, but it's really important to look beyond it and see how you're going to equip yourself for that world and what that world's going to be. So if there's anything here, get out of find a place where you can get out of the moment and actually look into the future. I think every geoscientist is in a moment where it seems to me that we all look back on a history of exploration and exploitation, but the future is all about stewardship and sustainability. And what does that mean? I have no idea, but I understand what the words mean, and I feel something in those words that sort of is saying to me, things are changing. The CV19 is a terrible blip on that change, but it is a blip that's going to accelerate things. It's going to change the way we live, change the way we relate, as people have said, and Lauren said particularly well. So I think the thing for me is just say to people is look beyond tomorrow into the future, because that's there's still lots of time for anybody in the early career network to modify their armory to be successful in that time frame.
Brilliant. Okay, so we've come to the end of the time, unfortunately. Some of the audience might be interested in the results of a recent survey by ICRAG, which is the the Irish Centre of Research in Applied Geoscience. And that was a survey on the impact of COVID-19 on the mineral industry. And that's going to be presented later today on the Ore Deposits Hub meeting, which begins at 5 p.m. this afternoon. So just to end, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our panel members. I think it's been a really insightful and useful and interesting discussion. I think we could continue for much longer, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you very much, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Likewise, a pleasure. Well done, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Josh.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers, Josh.